Two very interesting speeches who obviously could have gone on a lot longer and we've learned a lot more from them, but there's a lot to see. We've only got just over half an hour for the discussion, which means people will have to be brief, and I'm going to start cutting people off at 3 minutes. So we'll go around there. Phil,
We had a very good discussion in Waltham Forest Left Unity on Thursday night on precisely this question, which comrades from RS21 also came to. And the question of how are you going to be able to sell people, you know, austerity and not having flat screen televisions and all that kind of stuff. And I think, you know, the hostility of the state, or the states, to the green movement, to environmentalist movements, isn't just about a direct action. It's about the fact that the ecological critique goes to the heart. It's a dagger pointing at the heart of consumer capitalism, because it points to a whole different way of producing, consuming and living, which breaks up the whole array of consumer capitalism that they have created. And the first thing, before we start talking about what ordinary people do, to address, I think, is luxury production. Since the advent of neoliberalism, the swivelling towards luxury production is nicely outlined in Mikhail Chossudovsky's book, The Globalization of Poverty, has been fantastic. Huge amounts of human resources and material resources are siphoned off to something that affects just a small proportion of the world's population. But of course it leaks down through the consumer spectacle to broader layers of the population. For example, in Japan, it's reckoned that more than 50% of all adult women have at least one Louis Vuitton bag. Of course, not the expensive ones, but much more expensive and using much more resources than you need to have a bag to put something in to carry about. I think within Marxist traditions, there have been people who've addressed this question of how we produce, how we consume, the consumer spectacle. The first one was Guy Debord in his Society of the Spectacle in 1967 already, and even Herbert Marcuse in One-Dimensional Man, all this stuff about how capitalism generates false needs. And I don't think it's about persuading people, it's about a movement which gradually pushes forward these things and attracts young people to it. And the other point was, are the capitalists mad? Don't they realise they're destroying the planet? And as someone mentioned the film Elysium, I don't know if people have seen it, recent science fiction film, where the bourgeoisie go and create their own artificial planet while the Earth sinks into ecological catastrophe. Well, not quite that, but even 10 years ago, the Pentagon was talking about what's going to happen when we have ecological collapse. It's about guarding the borders, it's about militarisation of society. That's what it's all about, and the guarding the water supply, all that, that's what they're preparing for. They know it's going to happen. They can't stop the consumer spectacle. It's at the heart of what they do.
Thank you. Yeah, come right up there.
Amelia Womack, Green Party. I think it's really interesting, the word ecology, because I come from a science background, and ecology is basically the interaction of species with its environment. I think what's really important is the word interaction, and sitting here as a British socialist, I think we really need to be thinking about that. So you've got these pyramids of how the world works. You've got the economy, which we all know is based on the workers. You wouldn't have an economy if it wasn't for the workers driving production. But actually there wouldn't be any jobs if there wasn't an environment for those workers to create goods from. So it feels like everyone should be focusing on the environment and that interaction that we have between the workers and the environment, and therefore the economy, which is one of the workshops will be later. It's interesting that you brought up the Queen's speech and the fracking idea, because I work for a campaign called End Ecocide, and this campaign basically tries to eliminate this ecocide, which is basically like genocide for the environment, the long-term destruction of the environment. And when you're discussing with people about this law, basically provide an opportunity when you're talking about drilling in the Arctic. You could say you can't do that, it's ecocide. Or the tar sands, you'd be like, you know what, that's against the law, we can't do that. And this law, one of the things that prevents this law coming about is because it would completely change the way that we work with our land. You'd have to change other laws to enable it. But if we're able to change things like the trespass law so easily, why aren't we able to change the law to something that would benefit society so much? We are campaigning for this law on the basis that it's a human right. We're looking at that interaction between the environment and humanity, saying that it's a human right to have fresh water, food, and a healthy land to live on. And really kind of looking at what that interaction is. Yeah, that was pretty much it. But yeah, if you look up End Ecocide, it would be great if you want to sign our petition and get involved with the campaign. But I think it's a really important way of looking at that interaction between what the environment means and actually calling it out as a human right and something that we should have as a basic fundamental need.
Thank you.
Dr. Atlan leads social resistance. I think when Morris sort of going through his, I've got 3 minutes, so it's going to jump, through his translation of Marx, it was a bit like us. Really, we couldn't read Marx's Capital till the Penguin translation came out. The Engels, the American versions were just useless. So it's only in the last 20 years that most normal people are able to grasp it as opposed to academics. And the dialectics of nature, and along with materialism and empiricism by Lenin, they provided the basis for me getting my chemistry degree by doing half the amount of work of everyone else. And my mates. We didn't get very good degrees, but we enjoyed ourselves massively because it provided a framework which chemistry just didn't have. And it's in essence the society. Basically, the capitalist system in Britain produced the Stern report. The government produced a huge, massive report that explained that unless you actually did something now, you're going to have to spend trillions of dollars to try and save society in the future. And this huge, scientifically worked out book was completely ignored, absolutely ignored. And I think we have to ask ourselves, they're obviously not mad, these capitalists, they're obviously not mad. And why this logical succession doesn't work? And the answer, obviously, is capitalism. And changing the nature of capitalism and looking at it, and then looking at the environment, are two very complicated differences. In the Fourth International, it wasn't the people really in the advanced West that came to this conclusion. It was the people in the front line. It was Badrul and the comrades in Ashok in Bangladesh. It was the comrades in the Philippines that began to make that impact and begin to change the way that the Fourth International, and hence our group in social resistance in England, began to think about that environment. But the work, I think some of this theoretical work that we still have to struggle with has to be still looked over. I'm a follower really of Ted Benton, and his argument, which I think might derive from Foster, because I haven't read a lot of Foster's stuff, but that really we have a contradiction between capital and labour, and that's a fundamental contradiction. But there is a bigger contradiction between the capitalist system itself and the environment, and that's what I think Ted calls the second contradiction of capital. And I think that's the situation we live in. It's how we overcome those two contradictions to develop an alternative eco-socialist vision of the sort of future that we want. So I think the stuff that Natalie was saying provides some of the bare bones for that kind of society that we want and we need. But we have to, I suppose, I think, begin to look forward to a different kind of transitional programme that manages to fuse these two things together. There's lots more, of course.
Thanks, Jane.
I'm Jane Ennis, somebody left William Morris Society, and I want to say a few more words about William Morris. Well, it's partly about me because I wrote the article, but I'm not Charles Burner and Trumpet, but I gave a paper in Social History Society, which was a William Morris first Green Socialist, and if you Google it, you'll find it because I've put it on the web. And Morris does actually take up Marx's ideas about the integration of humanity and nature, and he gives actually specific examples because in his work as a craftsman and as a weaver and as a dyer, he'd seen, for instance, the pollution of the river air from the textile factories in Leeds. I think he was actually the first person who took up this question. I mean, are we going to sort of, strip the planet of its resources to sort of satisfy our own needs? So as I say, if you want to Google that, I can't actually remember what the URL is, but you'll find that, and it gives you quite a lot of information about Morris's approach to what we now call ecosocialism. You see, for the 19th century, they didn't really, I mean, the word ecology existed, but it was hardly used, and the environment still didn't actually mean nature. It just kind of meant that anything could be your environment, like the living room was your environment, and it sort of developed within the 20th century, the 21st century, to mean something specific. So I'd say Morris was one of the first, if not the first, to sort of integrate the Marx's ecology to actually understand Marx's ecological thought. Next week, if anybody's interested, it's open garden weekend. You can come to Kelmscott House and see the garden, which is sort of it's for the Morris Society. Okay, I'll be there to give you more information about Morris if you like. Now, I just also wanted to say a few words about this perception of the Green Movement as sort of lentil-eating, sandal-wearing, fruit juice drinkers. It's unfortunate because that's in a way how it did start. And it is quite difficult for a large section of the population. They perceive it as sort of middle-class hobby. And a lot of our campaign is to get people to see that ecosocialism, you get redundant steelworkers in Yorkshire, they sort of see us as sort of those sort of people who sort of faff about doing organic gardening, and how does it actually address the needs of the industrial northwest, which is blighted out of existence by Thatcher's policies. We've got a long way to go to get people to perceive how ecosocialism can actually sort of meet their needs. I mean, for instance, you see things I do actually do organic gardening, I'm a vegetarian, blah, 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 but that's only the half of it. That's maybe how people start, how people get into the Green Movement in the first place. But what we need to do is somehow, get the message across that it's very much moving to the left. I think Natalie's gone a long way to it. Yes, I'm sorry. Anyway, so that's it. So anyway, that's basically a couple of points I wanted to make. Ken.
Yeah, John Walker, RS21. I'm interested to realise that your criticism helped your chemistry degree. I would have thought if you're doing a physics degree, of course, you're probably better off reading Pannekoek's reply than as philosopher. That's by the by. I mean, the thing is that the capitalists, of course, are not mad about in the way that they're creating the thing. But the essential thing about capitalism is that it's about producing. It's about a firm. It's not about the economy as a whole producing things. It's about a firm producing things, and then another firm, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, they don't necessarily. No capitalist looks at the totality. They look at their own balance sheet. They sell something to you. That's the end of it. So, what happens to that when it wears out? That's not their concern. They don't see. Back to the sustainable agriculture. Sustainable industrialism is conceptually possible, but that's not what they're after. Because that's not what they. So you get these capitalists, and they perfectly do not see any contradiction between them producing things and not worrying about actually, in the long run, creating waste, and on the other hand, getting worried about an ecological crisis. There isn't. The other thing is, of course, that we'll also have to realise is that they don't necessarily pay for it. I mean, I was just thinking about this the other week, and the phrase from the Bible about the sun shines on the just and the unjust alike came to mind, because that suggests we're all in it together. The sun shines or not. The thing is, of course, some of us can afford sunshades and some of us can't. So the outcome of these things are actually defined by social things. So I mean, you know, the science fiction thing, I seem to have missed that one, but in fact the idea about the ruling class jumping into space was actually something that Marge Piercy had in one of her alternative futures in Woman on the Edge of Time. Excellent novel which you should all read. It also talks about ecosocialism. I mean, it's very relevant in Scotland. But I mean, you don't have to go that extreme. Of course, science fiction, you know, you do take the extremes and to the thing. Actually, you know, they're thinking in terms that they can escape the ecological crisis because they make us pay. So there's a class dimension here. And I think this is one of the things when Jane sort of talked about from a different angle about getting it over. But that we need to be thinking about the class thing because it's precisely your unemployed steel workers in the northwest or wherever, or in the northeast perhaps, who are going to be paying for the ecological crisis and not the middle class rental eaters. If we're talking about eco-socialism, we ought to be talking about class war and eco-socialism.
Sarah,
Okay, well I just wanted to pick up on a few things people said about how we try to change things. I have been quite a bit of time trying to work out how you could make more persuasive arguments, and people have mentioned, you know, there's so many blocks to consciousness, you know, the way society is organised in a spectacle, the way firms are divided, so most of the personnel kind of tend to think it's okay to keep doing what they're doing, or lentil eating is middle class. Well, it's kind of only middle class in this country. You know, if you go to the Middle East, for example, lentil eating is very working class. Well, obviously we, in our small numbers, can't, you know, approach everybody with all the arguments, unfortunately, at the same moment. But I just think we do have to sort of look at constantly to see which things we can make most use of. For example, at the moment, opinion polls say, I think it's over 70% of the population of this country are totally against fracking, and I think we should be doing everything we can to support the campaigns that are working on it. Another example, yes, I agree that capitalism can't solve these problems, but on the other hand, I've also read that there are huge problems with the finances of the shale industry in the States. You know, people from Shell saying it was a disaster to do it. Solar power investment may not be perfect, but it's better than shale. It's rushing up in the States because people can make a quick return from it. Germany is producing a huge amount of its power from solar power. Denmark, wind power. So we should make sure, whenever we can, that we're putting these examples in front of people. And there was one other thing, but I think I've forgotten it, so I'll wind up.
I just read that in the United States they've just passed a law to make it criminal for firefighters and medical staff to release any details of chemicals used in fracking. They can, to treat fires or to treat patients, they have to know what chemicals are used. But it's apparently now illegal for them to reveal this to anybody. They're so concerned about people knowing what's going on. Comrade.
Catherine Nugent, CBC. I wanted to talk a bit about the sort of global dimension of all this. Because you talked about how firms, individual capitalist firms, just want to produce something, make another profit, break down all the barriers that there are to making profit. But actually capitalists have quite a good instinct for flocking together and organising on a global level, and they mobilise local states to help them do that. And this is how, you know, primitive accumulation goes on around the world and continues to go on. And in the process, of course, the environment gets destroyed. So it seems to me that we cannot afford to overlook the global dimension, and we have to bring that into things. Because there are a lot of, even though that people campaign on the local level, and that's where people begin to campaign, and also where people begin to have class struggles, and but it's always the global nature of capitalism is implicated, isn't it? I think there are a lot of tensions in the fracking campaign. I think the idea, the phrase that we were against the industrialisation of the countryside, for instance, superficially I agree with that, but the countryside is a social construction. The idea of the countryside is a social construction. And actually, it could be about middle-class people being able to go to some nice second home or third home for a weekend and have a lovely weekend and refresh themselves and come back at the end of the day. Or it could be, so it could be about a lot of privilege. But nonetheless, we are against capitalism just coming in and doing what it wants and destroying everything around it. So I think that we need to have a discussion about, that kind of intervenes in all those different tensions. So back to my first point, is one of the tensions is the globalisation of things. That things aren't just about our local, our local countryside, our local situation, what's happening to us when the companies come in and do what they want to do in order to develop fracking. It's about what's going on in the whole world. So I think we need to sort of think about how we make demands that sum up that kind of global dimension. So I haven't got any answers to that.
Is anybody who hasn't yet spoken want to? No, in that case, if any of the people who have cut off want to add a little more, there is some time for the speakers to go.
In 1 minute.
Yep.
One of the things that comes out of these contradictions is that, contrary to what Alan says, we now live in the biggest expansion of biodiversity ever in the history of the world. There are at least 1,000 people in Britain developing new forms of life in their back kitchens. and if some of this stuff that's been discussed in Japan about stem cells works, they'll be creating quite big organisms like zombies walking the damn streets. Yeah? They won't last long, but there will be, because there is this enormous explosion. But of course it's not useful, and it could kill us all. That's all.
Well, the speaker's going to come back.
I think, I was planning to start.
How much time have we got now?
We've got 20 minutes.
I see. Okay.
Did you?
No.
Well, if no one has any more to say, then I'll ask the speakers to sum up for a few more minutes. So about 7 minutes each.
Shall I go first? I thought this was a very useful discussion. Marx talked about the inorganic body, not your heart or kidneys, brain, arms, but the inorganic body being the environment is part of us, and we're inextricably linked, and if the environment dies, so do we. And capitalism is cutting into that inorganic body, and it's going to leave a scar, the biodiversity. So we've just got to stop it cutting into that before it actually kills off the environmental, disaster sort of occurs. But I think there's plenty of hope, and there's still time. Campaign Against Climate Change is coming out with a Time to Act campaign, linking that in with the 20th of September and March for the climate this year, and also the Paris, the Coalition of Partners, the COP in 2015, where people are starting to talk about bringing Paris to a standstill to show the importance of it. Basically, people are building towards that, and I think Natalie Bennett was saying that thing about equilibrium with jumps. I think she's right about that, or we do need a jump anyway in the political equilibrium. And maybe we can. Tony Cliff was a leader of the party I used to be in, and he said once, I love the poll tax. Why? Because it attacks everybody, it attacks every worker. In a way, I don't love fracking, but everywhere around the country where the frackers are trying to frack, people are reacting to it. In a way, I kind of love fracking, because that gives us the way in. They're going to try and ram it down our throats, so we can use it to try and turn it to our advantage and on the movement towards you know, that Paris COP next year, people build towards that. It's really odd what to say on it.
Okay, well, I think there's sort of two streams that we were talking about. The one is the issue of you know, for God's sake, are capitalists mad and so on? Of course they're not. I mean, I can remember being at where is it, the book thing, Hay Festival some years ago, and Brown, who was at that time, of course, the head of BP, goes to speak, and I thought, this is amazing. This guy, one of the most powerful capitalists on earth, is actually talking about the disastrous effect on the planet of the use of hydrocarbons and how we need to move towards a completely different basis and so forth. And in the end, I mean, the only practical thing he actually suggested is that there's this Canadian firm that's working on converting straw into biofuel, so you should buy some shares in that. And the thing is that actually summed it up, because actually individual capitalists are not mad necessarily, or individual undertakings, but they actually are not free agents. I mean, it's interesting. Going back to Morris, you know, that he made his money came from his father's investments in Cornish mines, which is pretty sort of blood money, very much. But as that disappeared, because Morris started out very wealthy, but in fact these investments soon started to go away, because if you build something like Red House in Windscastle, then it does. And so the firm, as it was called at that time, which was a partnership, he actually had to turn it into a business that could actually, because otherwise he was going to go broke. And so Morris was a very astute businessman, but one of the things is he was continually, he was in this situation that his workers, for example, almost uniquely in Victorian Britain, they had sick pay, they had paid holidays, they had maternity leave, you know, they had and very good rates of pay. They also had for example, the only woman in the print unions worked for Kelmscott Press. And the thing is, of course, that what he found was that he kept coming up with these ideas of how, you know, sort of we should be making the lives of ordinary people more lovely with them. But actually, he had to make money by selling at the absolute top end of luxury goods, you know, like, for example, being hired to redecorate St James's Palace. Now here we have Britain's first green Marxist, and he said that was a jolly good job, so they made a good deal of money out of it. So capitalists don't have the freedom to move, and in fact basically the more enlightened an undertaking becomes, it will affect the rate of profit and it will go bust. So that we at the same time, capitalism is incredibly dynamic, and it's a shapeshifter. And so, for example, the Tories, I think, are being absolutely stupid. They're being absolutely stupid against their own interests. Like they've this ridiculous antipathy they've got towards wind power. And actually, of course, what will happen is as the fuel situation gets worse and worse, then suddenly they'll realise that all this is a jolly good, like in Germany, there's good money to be made from sustainable renewable energy. But the other issue is actually our side. How do you, when you say, look, we need to, what's the date now? Within 16 years, we need to reduce, it's not enough, you can't reduce CO2 emissions in a straight line because the effect is going up incrementally. One has to actually reduce fast now. and slower later on. And so we're saying to people, look, we need to have an 80% reduction, CO2 reduction, by 2030. And that's going to change everybody's lives very dramatically. Well, the problem is, if one starts from saying, and we're doing this because we're threatened by this gas, which is, you can't see it, you can't smell it, and it doesn't do you any harm if you breathe it in. And it's going to have these, absolutely, all the scientists say, absolutely terrible consequences, and we're not exactly sure the detail of which particular, like for example, will we get a lot hotter, or will we end up with a temperature, with a climate like Labrador, which is on the same latitude, and actually it could be either. And so we don't know what the effect's going to be in detail. We don't know exactly when it's going to happen, but you need to change your lives completely. And it seems to me that's where the environmental movement has actually tended, I have to say, tended at one level to wither on the vine, with the exception of for example, campaign against climate change. Really the most important part of it is the trade union group, trade union campaign, which has actually come up with, as it were, a practical program saying, listen, this is something which can be done and needs to be done, and this is what, and here are the benefits we can get. And I think we've got to actually talk in terms of saying, you know, that where there is, for example, if you ask people, what do you think about the electricity and gas firms in this country? Well, well, of course, they're all sharks, aren't they? They're all gangsters, they're all crooks. So you don't have to argue the case for why we should reform the way that we produce and distribute energy, particularly when we can say, and this would actually mean, you know, can mean the end of fuel poverty. It can mean that poor people can actually, you know, perhaps pensioners could have free fuel allowances and things like that. So that can go with the grain of just like one of the points that Natalie made. And I cannot understand why the Labour Party doesn't pick it up. Is a renationalisation of railways, because it's hugely popular, and it wouldn't bloody cost anything. Well, for God's sake, are they completely daft? So it seems to me that we did what I'm, you know, arguing for is that we look in really new and refreshed ways at the development of transitional politics, of a transitional programme that can actually build a mass popular movement, rather than what the left's very good at doing is actually sort of saying, right, well, in what way does this, what paragraph of the 1940 programme covers this, or the approach, I have to say, rather pious approach of the rest of the Green movement, which is to actually stand on street corners saying, you know, you're doomed, you know. So I think that we have to look at really positive programme, and work, you know, be prepared in a sense to lay off the scare story stuff, unfortunately, because it has had a negative effect. Over the last 10 years, fewer people are actually sympathetic to the idea of having to do something like climate change than there were before.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, comrades, for a useful and interesting discussion. Lunch will be served downstairs. If you haven't bought a ticket, I'm sure there'll still be some available. On your programmes, you'll see sessions, workshops start again at 3:30.
Just one thing, Morris called part of his job minister to the swinish luxury of the rich. It was the contradiction. You see, didn't Engels have the same contradiction? He was wealthy, and if Engels hadn't been wealthy, Marx would never be able to write his Capital. So, you know, it's a problem.
Very good. If you had a
what I'm saying is the zombies
to buy one of these last few remaining copies.
Be educated to read books.
Second edition. No, it's the edition.